So hello everyone, we are back. It's 1 p.m. Eastern time.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Dorothy Alexandre, and I'll be your host for the second day of our Shockproofing Communities Forum. As you know, part of this meeting is happening in person in Ottawa.
Thank you, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome. My name is Dorothy Alexandre. I'm so happy to be here. I feel blessed, actually, to be taking part of this Shockproofing Communities Summit. As you know, there are hundreds of delegates right now in Ottawa doing the same kind of work that we're doing right now. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you with our moderator for this first workshop, online workshop on service continuity guidelines. So please welcome Karen Campbell. So Karen, it's the mic is for you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you all online with us today. My name is Karen Campbell, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'm joining you today from Ottawa, Ontario, where the Shockproofing Summit is actually happening in person as well. We're in the virtual summit sort of room, offering the programming to you today. So I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, on the unceded territories of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin nations. And I'm very excited to host this session, to moderate the session today on service continuity guidelines for the gender-based violence sector. Before I bring our panelists on for the conversation, I'm going to give you a little bit of a context about this, what they'll be presenting to you today. So when the pandemic hit, organizations in the gender-based violence sector saw surging demand for their services because gender-based violence rates were increasing across the country. We've come to know this as a shadow pandemic, and this is something that happened not just in Canada, but across the world, and it is something that happens whenever communities are under stress. Gender-based violence rates increase. In an already overstretched sector with limited capacity to absorb the shock, gender-based violence service providers really had a lot of work to do, while also dealing with the realities of the pandemic themselves as people, as individuals, in their families, in their communities. So we were all trying to figure out how this was going to work, and they had to also deal with this increasing demand on their services. From the beginning of the pandemic, the Canadian Women's Foundation has been working with and alongside gender-based violence organizations. We've been funding them. We've been consulting with them to find out what they need and to try to get resources to them. And throughout that time, we've been asking them, you know, what would have made a difference for you when this pandemic hit? If there were things that you could have had in place, what would you have been looking for? What would have helped to shock-proof you as an organization, us as a sector, against this sort of surge and this challenge of dealing with excess demand on services? One of the things, among the many recommendations that they made, one of the things they said was that they needed emergency management and response plans and tools, but that despite knowing that they needed these things, this was out of reach for many organizations. Hiring expensive consultants to come in and create an emergency plan for your organization is something that folks don't have necessarily the resources to do. They don't have the money to do it. They don't have the time to do it. And they also find that when they're talking to people working in the emergency management sector, that they don't necessarily know the lived realities of the service users who are coming to their doors. And that makes a difference to the kinds of plans that are implemented. At the same time as having these conversations with folks in the sector, we had actually been working with academics and practitioners in the emergency management field, and we had asked them to take a look at federal and provincial and territorial emergency management plans that the government had been putting into place. And they produced some research for us showing the significant lack of a gender-based analysis plus in these plans, meaning that populations were not only were they left out of the plans, but if they're left out of the plans, then of course they will be left out of the response. And you know, I can share the links to that research in the chat box as well in just a minute. But hearing the need in among the service providers for some kind of guidance about how to fortify their own organizations, we connected with some of the folks that had been doing that research for us. And we asked them to create specific guidance for the gender-based violence sector on how to identify what are your critical functions, how can you create strategies to fortify those functions. And that's what we're going to be sharing today. It's the guidance that these amazing women have created specifically for this sector. Before we begin, I do want to mention that in addition to our amazing interpretation and captioning team that's with us today, we're also fortunate to have a visual artist online. Her name is Adriana, and she is going to be creating a dynamic illustration of the session today. She will have her camera on, but we're not going to spotlight her on the screen. If you would like to see her work as it progresses, you can look for her video feed among the panelists and pin it to your screen by clicking the 3 dots in the corner of her video feed and selecting pin. At the end of the panel discussion, we'll invite Adriana on to present her visual interpretation of the panel discussion and yeah, to tell you about what she's drawn. If you have questions during the session, please feel free to use the Q&A box, pop them in there, and at the end, to the extent that we have time, we will pose those back to Alex, Carmen, and Magda, who will be presenting today. So with that, I am going to ask Alex, Carmen, and Magda to come on screen, turn your cameras on, and I'll just give a second for you to get spotlit as well. Welcome. All right. There's Alex, there's Magda, and there's Carmen. Fantastic. All right, so welcome. I'm going to turn this over to you. I'll ask you all to please introduce yourselves and then you can go right ahead with your presentation today.
Great, thanks, Karen. Just making sure everybody can hear me okay. Yes, perfect, got a thumbs up. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today for this session. And thank you to Karen for providing some context around this project. So my name is Alex Valaroso and my pronouns are she and her. I'm located in a small rural community here in northern BC as a guest on the traditional territory of the Latako Dene. I hold an MA in disaster and emergency management with a focus on gender and disaster, and have a number of specialized certificates and training in GBA Plus or intersectional analysis and addressing GBV in emergencies. I've had the opportunity to work in government, academia, and the not-for-profit sector across Canada and internationally. I've also been fortunate to participate and contribute in a number of conferences, presentations, and lectures on gender, disaster, GBA Plus, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. I currently sit on the board of the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management, which has allowed me to create additional awareness on gender and disaster. At this time, I'm the principal consultant of Valaroso Consulting, where I take on an assortment of projects and research geared towards disaster, gender, and GBA+. I also help organizations identify and develop equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies so that they can create ideal workplaces, products, and services. In terms of this project, I was very interested in working on it because of the opportunity to contribute to the development of guidelines for service organizations addressing GBV across Canada. And because gender and disaster is a focus area of mine, this project really resonated with me and the ability to support the important work being done in the anti-GBV sector around resiliency and business continuity, especially given the widespread impact of disasters in community. It was also the ability of this project to raise the profile of the relationship between gender and disaster, and hopefully garner the attention, funding, and support that's needed to not only demand the respect of this work that this work deserves, but to also shift the landscape in emergency management around GBV. It's really exciting for me to think that I could be part of this and to help make a meaningful contribution to this field of practice and improve the lives of others. I'm very pleased to be here with you today and look forward to sharing our work on the guidelines. And I'll pass it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves as well. I think we might need to go back one slide though. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, hello. My name is Carmen O'Neill. Similar to Alex, I'm a gender and disaster management specialist. I'm extremely passionate about collaborative, inclusive, and gender transformative approaches to the practice. I've also worked in the gender-based violence sector for over 10 years, and now I'm more specifically in emergency management and disaster management, and I've also worked in business continuity planning as well. My experience extends with governments, nonprofit organizations, and international agencies, and even into the Caribbean, where I worked for several years on disaster recovery projects and climate risk management programs with the United Nations Development Program. I have a Master's of Arts in Disaster Emergency Management from Royal Roads University, and also have various certifications and specialized training, including Gender Pro, Gender-Based Analysis Plus, and Associate Business Continuity Professional training from the Disaster Recovery Institute. So my interest in this project is twofold. I mean, as someone who's worked in the gender-based violence sector for many years, I have felt firsthand the need for service continuity planning to ensure that there are no gaps in services in the community during a disaster or emergency. Also, I'm very passionate about merging gender and disaster management, which is a little bit of a new thing in Canada. So I'm very passionate about it and extremely excited to be on this project. So I'll pass it over to Magda.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I coming through clearly enough? Perfect. It was a little dicey at sound check. It's great to be here. If I'm honest, I'm a bit nervous to be here. The good thing is, because I'm hiding behind this screen, I can't see the large number of people I'm presenting to, and I'm overwhelmed because I have an appreciation now, after having worked on this project, of the incredible work that you folks do in this sector. I came into this project with a very limited experience in the gender-based violence sector. My primary area of work is security, disaster, and emergency management. So I come from that side of this project, very much on the technical side of disaster planning. I've worked in the multi-sport sector, energy and utilities, and the government sector. In that time, so I've been working in disaster and emergency management since about 2015. And in that time, I've spent about 4,000 hours, last time I counted, in emergency operations centers, the whole hair on fire situation, running around and trying to coordinate response activities to everything from natural disasters, doing on-site response to hurricanes in 2017 in the United States. I had a chance to deploy down there as well. So doing critical infrastructure rebuilds, technology failure rebuilds, large-scale operational interruption recovery activities following these types of events for the last 8 years. My first connection into the nonprofit world from this lens was in 2020, where I co-created and co-ran an organization called 1033 with my really good friend and colleague, Alicia Khan. And this organization was created in order to link small businesses, nonprofits, and emergency social service providers with pro bono access to emergency management and business continuity specialists during the pandemic to help folks pivot their operations and respond to all the changes that you experienced during that time. So it was a very insightful project for me. My eyes were opened to the challenges that you were all facing. We had a team of over 90 volunteers coming across from 6 different countries to provide services to organizations all across Canada. And we got a snapshot of the challenges that you all faced. And as a result of that project, I got linked up with this terrific team here a couple of years later and got a chance to work on these guidelines. In the background, I'm always passionate about sharing my knowledge about disaster and emergency management. Anyone who's willing to listen to me, yammer on about it, and that will be you folks today. I also teach part-time at York University in their undergraduate disaster emergency management program. I teach business continuity management there. And where am I currently? I'm currently in Paris, France, working on the 2024 Paris Olympic and Paralympic Games for the security group, designing their game security command center. And now I'll pass it back over to Alex, who will take us into the first part of the presentation.
Thanks, Magda. We move to the next slide. Great, thank you. So given the amount of time we have today, we thought it would be best to introduce the guidelines by highlighting a few key components. This includes a brief overview of the project, including the background, its purpose, the integration of Gender-Based Analysis Plus, so known as GBA Plus, as well as the tools and resources contained in the guidelines. For those who may not be familiar, we're also introducing the concept of service continuity planning and its value for organizations. Next slide. So yeah, as mentioned, we'll just do a high level overview of the project. So next slide. So there are several existing operating constraints for GBV service providers, including funding and increased demand for services, and this has created service gaps within the sector. And as we know, these gaps are then exacerbated during disasters. The lack of sustainable and consistent GBV services severely impacts communities and service users. So Karen has already provided some context to this, so I think we can summarize by saying that GBV is a whole of community issue, and it is in the broader community interest to enable improved continuity of services for the sector. Next slide, please. So organizations which provide GBV services can use these guidelines to prepare for and safely and effectively respond to situations such as emergencies and disasters that disrupt their normal day-to-day operating environment. By using these guidelines, organizations can not only identify the steps required to produce a service continuity plan, they are empowered to begin their planning and implement this based within their specific context. Another important component is that these guidelines also integrate GBA Plus considerations into service continuity planning, ensuring a more intersectional approach for organizations and service users. Next slide. So first, I'll just touch on GBA Plus. The folks here are most likely familiar with GBA Plus as an analytical process used to assess systemic inequality. It's meant to go beyond sex and gender, so age, race, ethnicity, indigeneity, religion, ability, immigration status, and so on, and considers how the perspectives of people with different social identity factors intersects with various power dynamics that influence our experiences, especially that of discrimination and oppression. Ultimately, the purpose of GBA Plus is to support the development of inclusive and applicable policies, programs, and initiatives. We recognize that service providers may already be incorporating or applying aspects of GBA Plus or intersectional analysis in their work. And although not fully integrated across Canada, GBA Plus is one suggested method of intersectional analysis to gauge how people are being impacted and why. We've included an example of the GBA Plus process in the appendices as well. So as mentioned, GBA Plus was integrated throughout this project, and this happened in two main ways. First, it's the framework we implemented in terms of the research and data collection used to understand and assess the context of service continuity planning across the sector. This information was collected and used to develop the guidelines. Next, GBA Plus was integrated as the approach taken to inform and guide organizations in developing their own service continuity plans, which is reflected in the tools and resources created for this project. Next slide. The central to our approach to the guidelines was to ensure we work collaboratively with subject matter experts and those working in diverse organizations across the sector. This also included the development of a national sector survey to collect data from organizations. We were fortunate to work with a fantastic and informative sector advisory committee who provided insight and clarity to the sector and helped guide the overall process of the guidelines. Next slide, please. We're also very appreciative of those who took the time to participate in our survey. I suspect many of you are here today, and this was invaluable in terms of really understanding the context of the sector and how to shift between day-to-day operations and responding to emergencies. So we'll just share a few brief stats about the data. We had 215 responses to our survey with national representation, including 23 Francophone and 192 Anglophone participants, plus an additional 12 international or nationally based organizations. There were also 13 subsectors represented. So these were types of services in the sector such as transition houses, crisis centers, resource centers, and so on, which were captured from the survey. And as you can see, organizational budgets ranged from 100,000 to over 10 million. Next slide. So the target audience for the guidelines include community-based organizations, service providers, advocacy organizations, and NGOs. One of the main goals for this project was to make service continuity planning accessible and to support organizations who may not have the time, capacity, or expertise in conducting their own planning. As you work your way through the guidelines, you'll see that we've taken a bit of a layered approach. First, we have the technical instructions, which provide the how-to on service continuity planning. Then we have the narrative running throughout the guidelines. This is about a small business owner who's working through their own service continuity planning to help demonstrate the process. This is followed by prompts to apply what you're learning to your own planning as you complete the process step by step. Lastly, we have a number of resources throughout the guidelines and within the appendices to support your learning and application of service continuity planning. Another goal for the guidelines was to be able to use them as a framework to advocate for core funding or additional funding for organizations. It's a very concrete way to demonstrate gaps and opportunities around service provision and what organizations can realistically manage in the day-to-day environment and what gets streamlined in the event of emergency. I'll pass it over to my colleagues to share more about this process. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so about service continuity planning, we're just going to do a bit of an overview. What is service continuity planning? What is its value to the gender-based violence sector? And then we'll go into a little bit about the process and what to expect when you're doing your service continuity plan. So next slide. Okay, so what is it? So service continuity is the ability of an organization to continue to provide their essential or critical services in the event of an emergency. The planning side of it is essentially planning for potential service disruptions and employing mitigation measures to ensure the effective coordination and implementation of strategies to maintain the continuity of essential services. So just to simplify that, service continuity planning will allow you to continue providing your services to the community during an emergency or disaster. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is its value? So as we know, we are in an increasingly volatile operating landscape with rapidly changing risks and challenges, including climate change, disasters, pandemics, all that reveal the social inequalities and power dynamics that are embedded in our communities and social systems that can have significant impacts on organizations that respond to gender-based violence. We also have economic uncertainty and technological advancements, and organizations have to consistently adapt to these technological advancements and try to keep up to date while trying to manage risks like cyber threats and data breaches. So not to depress you at all, but that being said, service continuity planning can play a critical role in helping organizations address these volatile conditions. So planning ahead can help you minimize the impact of potential disruptions so your organization can ensure that you can continue providing your essential services to the community. Beyond that, service continuity planning is also an investment in organizational stability. So this can not only improve your ability to deliver your critical services, but it also protects your staff and volunteers who do this important work. And then that ultimately impacts your service users. So an important value add for the gender-based violence sector is that planning ahead for service disruptions will allow you to proactively identify situations where employee burnout might increase. So for example, when an emergency arises, rather than employing ad hoc strategies that could negatively impact staff and volunteers, such as increasing hours or unpaid overtime, which we did unfortunately see a lot of during the pandemic. Planning allows you to carefully create and choose strategies that not only maintain your critical operations, but also protect your staff. So I just want to note that when we look at the gender-based violence sector, this is crucial because a lot of the time staff and volunteers are also survivors and they're already exposed to trauma, burnout, vicarious trauma due to the nature of the work. And then this is compounded by their own trauma or lived experience. So when we plan ahead for a service disruption, we can proactively identify mitigation efforts or strategies that consider the impact to staff and volunteers while ensuring services can continue. This is why service continuity planning is so important for organizations in this sector. And this is also why using a GBA plus lens is important to service continuity planning. Using this lens will allow you to consider how your plan impacts different groups of people and ensure it not only doesn't cause harm, but also protects your staff, volunteers, and service users. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so unfortunately it does have some limits. Service continuity planning focuses on the continuity of essential services, and it will not address all of your organizational risks. It can also potentially be time consuming. So it's important to acknowledge, of course, that due to chronic sector underfunding, organizations that respond to gender-based violence generally do not have sufficient funding as is, let alone to be able to conduct comprehensive service continuity plans, understandably so. So, and depending on your organization's size and complexity of operations, the service continuity planning process can take a lot of time and may require the involvement of dedicated personnel to guide the implementation process, which is not always possible. However, with that being said, please don't let this deter you because it can be completed in very small incremental steps. So don't let this planning process overwhelm you and deter you from even trying. What you can do is take a look at our guidelines and take some of the suggestions that we put in there and just start to take some small steps to building your plan as time allows you. And that way you can start to address those things and start to get a plan going. Okay, so a viable service continuity program does require maintenance. Your organization's external operating environment and pressures do change over time, and the techniques and methods that you use to respond to these changes must also change and adapt. So when you're looking at maintenance, we do suggest that you do take a look at your plan at least once a year if possible, or when you have any large organizational changes. Take a look at the plan, maintain it, and yeah. Okay, next point. Service continuity planning only works when all members of an organization are aware of the plans and processes. So all staff will need to know what role they play in every phase of the plan. All right, so despite these limitations, service continuity planning is an essential tool for organizations to minimize the impact of disruptions and ensure the continuity of your critical operations. It's one of the best ways organizations can protect their operations, their service users, their staff, and even their reputation in challenging operating conditions. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And I'll pass it off to Magda here, who will talk about the service continuity planning process.
Thanks, Carmen. Just quickly toggle my screen here. All right, thanks for the setup to both Alex and Carmen. So we talked a lot about we've talked a lot about the words service continuity planning, and I'm excited to be the person to walk you through the process. What we're effectively talking about is a 5-step process. It's detailed very clearly, hopefully, actually, in the guidelines, along with a lot of the examples and tools that Alex and Carmen both mentioned. So definitely encourage you to go in there and examine some of the points that I discuss in a few minutes if you have particular questions about them. But we'll do our best, or I'll do my best, to give you a nice introduction into what service continuity planning is. So as I mentioned, it's a 5-step process involved in producing a service continuity plan. And they are the 5 steps you see here on the screen. Firstly, understanding what your mission, values, goals, and objectives are as an organization. Next, going into what your critical functions and resources are that are linked up to these big picture targets that you have for yourselves as an organization. Next, you look at what the risk of interruption is to your actual organization and the work that you do. Develop continuity strategies in response to those risks, and create a service continuity plan, one single document that, or a series of documents that outline how you're going to continue to deliver your services if you find yourselves in an interruption situation. One thing I will say about the guidelines as well, and just service continuity planning as a whole, which Carmen alluded to, it is a multi-step process, and it can very much be broken out into sections. One of the decisions that we made when producing these guidelines was to really focus on the inner workings of organizations. And what you'll probably notice, particularly those folks who are interested in examining their external environments, the types of conditions that exist around us that give rise to emergencies and disasters, we don't dwell on or spend a lot of time explaining risk management or going into external risk evaluation. And that was a decision we made to piecemeal this process into something a little bit more digestible and start introducing the process of service continuity of planning as something that we look at inward first to understand ourselves, our organizations, how we operate, and hopefully eventually layer on the external environment and how that now impacts us. Very obviously, there are extremely close ties between the two. It was just a calculated decision we had to make for this particular project. And it's certainly a point that we would encourage additional research in for any organizations that are interested in that or additional projects down the line. So we'll dive into the first step. If we can jump to the next slide, please. All right. So for those folks who found themselves in this scenario, which I suspect many of you already have, one thing that you'll have noticed about disaster and emergency management is that it's characterized by a sudden increase in workload. So something that maybe you would be traditionally doing in the span of a week or a month, you might find yourself doing in a single 24 or 48 hours. And that's just the nature of the situation. You suddenly see this sharp increase of tasks and issues that require your attention and intervention. And it's very easy to get lost in that work. And one of the most crucial points and one of the most crucial guideposts that you can follow is sticking to your organizational mission, values, goals, and objectives. It seems a little bit straightforward to repeat, but as I mentioned before, I've spent a lot of time in operations centers, and one of the first things that has a tendency to happen is you become very myopic on the situation and focus in on the exact details that situation is presenting, which of course is important, but losing sight of who you are, what you do, and why you do it can have some pretty detrimental effects on how you are impacted, how your organization is impacted, and how your service users are impacted by an event. So when we begin with service continuity planning, it's really important to clarify, why does your organization exist? What is your mission? How do you hope to impact the individuals that you're serving? And for this sector, of course, it would be individuals experiencing gender-based violence. So ultimately, by existing as an organization, what impacts do you hope to have on these individuals? And those would be your goals. what do you do to support individuals experiencing gender-based violence? And those are the actual objectives, the tangible activities or the work that you do day to day to realize your mission and your goals. And finally, what principles, beliefs, and perspectives inform how you do your work? What are your values as an organization? And all of this should be something that is echoed throughout every aspect of your service continuity plan. And that's why we wanted to begin the service continuity planning process or outline this as a critical step. Many people will just jump in straight into thinking about what are my critical activities, but if you can't link it back to your raison d'etre and what it is that you do day to day, things might not work as fluidly in times of crisis, or you may not be able to stick as truly to your mission and goals and get a little bit lost in the weeds in disaster response without taking this step. So from here, we jump into the next step. So following slide, please, which are the critical functions. So the critical functions are all those activities that you carry out across all aspects of your organization to realize your mission, goals, and objectives as an organization. And when disasters impact this sector, or when disasters impact your organization, we know that your sector in particular, the GBV sector, is one that's significantly under-resourced and underfunded. That was something that was very apparent from all the feedback we received from the advisory committee, from the survey participants, and it was something that we knew was going to be a focal point, and really is always a focal point of service continuity planning, but especially for this sector. So knowing that you're going to have a sudden spike in workload and you'll be working within a constrained resource environment, it's really important to pick out those elements of your organization, of your operations that cannot become interrupted, because they're going to have, that interruption is going to have detrimental effects on your organization, on your personnel, and of course, on the people who are seeking to use your services. So of course, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is the delivery of your actual core service, whether it's providing shelter, providing counseling services, doing your advocacy work. Those are probably the first things that come to mind, and rightly so, because that's why you exist, is to deliver those critical services that you do. But you can't lose sight of, and we certainly can't lose sight of, all the work that's happening in the background to power and enable the delivery of those services. So that's everything from the facilities management that exists to maintain a clean health and safety environment for your service seekers and service users rather, and your personnel. Finance activities to fund your programs and to fund all the work that you do. The governance structures behind the organization that enable an adherence to and a good application of your strategies and good guidance and steering throughout times of crisis, and indeed just day-to-day operations. HR and IT can go on, but all of these services, which are very easily overlooked in a disaster emergency management scenario where all of our efforts start to focus on service delivery, a lot of these activities can't stop. And the reason why is because many of them provide critical resources to your organization. So I'll just pause here for 1 second as well, because the word criticality as well is a little bit of a confusing term sometimes. And it's something that is very hard to define, and there's really no universal definition of it for a particular organization. Or rather, I should say there's no universal way of determining what is critical for a single organization. Every one of you is going to have a different way of defining what is critical, and that's going to be informed by a plethora of factors, certainly from where you're located, the services that you provide, the people that seek out your services. We've added a number of different elements into the guidelines to help you kind of evaluate and establish what is critical. Certainly layering in the GBA plus perspectives in this area of consideration to make sure that we're applying a more effective way of evaluating criticality. Some areas where we found some commonality in terms of evaluating criticality for folks working in the gender-based violence sector were the first one being, if a function becomes interrupted, is it going to have impact on my service users directly? And that was one immediate way in which we could distinguish something that was more critical versus less critical in terms of activities. Another one was, if I experience an interruption to this activity, is there going to be a corresponding loss to my organizational resources? Am I going to lose funding? Am I going to lose access to critical workforce or volunteers who help me do my work? A third one, a very important one, is the loss of a critical activity, excuse me, or function going to cause me to become non-compliant with laws or regulations? So certainly, a very important consideration to remain compliant with all the regulations, health and safety, data management, of course, when it comes to cyber issues, critical personal information that many of you maintain regarding your service users. So really important to remain compliant with laws and regulations that protect both the organization, your workforce, and the service users. And finally, another area that we identified as one being important when defining criticality is, are you going to experience a corresponding loss of collaborations or partnerships if you lose a particular function? So if you lose maybe part of your communication department or your partnership department because you've taken those resources and or those personnel and reassigned them to different work, are you potentially jeopardizing some of those partnerships, important partnerships that help you do your work day to day? So just a little bit of insight into evaluating criticality. As I said, we really encourage you to check out the guidelines which will provide a lot more detail on how to do this. And the big caveat is, what's going to be important for one organization will be completely different for another one, and that's totally fine. And that level of precise planning should actually do that for you, to give you a good clarity and insight into your own organizational priorities. When we talk about resources now, those are the actual assets or resources that you use to carry out your functions. So you can have two types: tangible assets or intangible assets. So your tangible assets are your people, your equipment, your facilities, all the physical items that come together to deliver the important work that you do. But just as important and often overlooked are the intangible items, such as knowledge, skills of your employees and your workforce and your volunteers who are providing and contributing towards the important work that you do. And of course, as Carmen mentioned as well, the reputation that you've worked really hard to develop, the credibility that you have with your funders, the credibility that you have with the individuals seeking your services. This is a resource to you. And it's one that we want to also figure out, how do we protect that so that you can continue to maintain that good reputation coming out of an event and continue to be that pillar within the community that you are. Some other examples of critical resources, financial resources, of course, your sources of funding, the workforce, the facilities that you work within, or information and data, as I mentioned before, and that organizational trust. So all of these things, the critical functions and resources, are what we're really trying to protect when we talk about service continuity planning. And we'll jump into the next slide to discuss what we're really trying to protect them from. So now we come upon the area of risk that I mentioned before. So this is not an area that we delve in too deeply. It's a whole separate area of practice within disaster and emergency management, but we can't not acknowledge it. This is the part of the process where you look outward from your organization to identify what's happening around you, geographically, within your sector, within your community, within your environment, to identify what potential conditions could give rise to an interruption to your business, to your organization, sorry. And when I say what can give rise to an interruption, it's really what can cause an interruption to your critical functions that I just mentioned. So having one of those critical functions either become delayed or interrupted, extended interrupted, or just disappear altogether, or impede your access to those critical resources, losing your access to volunteers and workforce because they can't come into work, losing a facility because of a natural disaster event that's happened around the area, losing access to utilities because, again, maybe a natural disaster event, ice storms are quite common nowadays with the volatile weather. So it's about, what do we do when we lose access to one of these things that we need? And what you're really looking to examine is to determine what types of events have a tendency to happen in my geographic environment based on where I'm located or within my sector. And now, as Carmen also mentioned before, many of us pretty much almost all of us are operating in a virtual environment as well. And so no longer do we have to just think about where we're operating physically, but also in the cyber environment when we're sharing data, when we're participating or running our operations virtually, what types of vulnerabilities exist in that space and what kinds of activities can become interrupted as a result of something happening in that space. And thirdly, we also have to think about supply chain interruptions, as we've seen during COVID and certainly now. We rely very heavily on perhaps, acquiring materials and equipment last minute. We don't do as much stockpiling as maybe we used to in the past because we're very accustomed to being able to order something very quickly, have it arrive the next day. But when we become really reliant on these last minute purchases or last minute supply runs, any sort of interruption to the supply chains can be very, very detrimental to our operations if we become accustomed to that. So another area of risk that we should look out for. When you're examining risks, you want to take a look at both what is the likelihood of it happening, and if it does, how impactful will it be? So if I'm working in an area or operating in an area where there's a lot of natural disasters, maybe a lot of flooding that takes place, does it happen frequently? What times of the year does it happen? Planning around those. And one area to just be mindful of as well, or one little bad habit that happens a lot with risk assessments or risk evaluation is hindsight bias. So we have a tendency oftentimes to plan to the last event that we just experienced and dedicate a lot of time and resources and energy to thinking about, my gosh, we just experienced a pandemic. We should definitely write a pandemic plan. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but you certainly want to take a look at what other kinds of risks might I be facing, and should I be preparing for something actually that's likelier to happen because maybe I live and work in a flood-prone area, and I should be looking at maybe making something more orientated towards that. So just be careful of that. And if you have any interest in this area, as I mentioned, not too much of it in the guidelines, but it's worth maybe taking a look at Public Safety Canada's website and seeing if your local emergency management organizations also post anything relating to risk assessments. Of course, it'll be your standard kind of generic documentation, but it maybe will provide some insight into how to carry out this process in an introductory way. You can jump into the next slide now. So now that we know what we want to protect, we know that it's at risk, we have to think about what will we do actually when these risks manifest and cause an interruption. And really here we're getting to the core of service continuity planning. And this is the process of identifying that strategy. What is my backup that I'm going to put in place if and when an interruption happens? And service continuity strategies are really those procedures and processes that we put in place to either prevent something from becoming interrupted, or knowing that it will become interrupted, mitigating the impact. So that means either lowering the chances of it becoming interrupted, or just making the impact of it less catastrophic or less significant on the organization. So very, very broadly speaking, there's a couple of categories of activities that you can take. We go into a lot of detail. We have a number of appendices that give you more precise and specific options that you can apply. A lot of this data was gathered from the survey. Great feedback that we got from folks across the sector of different strategies that they've employed themselves to continue to deliver functions. So we really encourage you to go in there and explore. We won't go into all of them today, but what I will say very broadly is that they come in, let's call them 6 different flavors. The first one is reduction. So choosing and acknowledging that you're not going to be able to do all the work that you normally do because you'll have to focus your resources into particular areas. You're going to reduce the amount of work that you do and focus it into critical areas in order to deliver the function. You'll create some redundancies. So either backup systems, backup equipment in case something fails. You can replicate your services across different sites or different locations. So if you have the good fortune of having multiple sites, or maybe the misfortune, because there's also the difficulty of running multiple sites. But if you have the possibility of replicating activities across 2 different sites, it can create some backups for you so that if one site goes down, you've got some backups elsewhere. One thing that we saw, which was so characteristic of the sector and I thought was really, really nice, is a lot of resource sharing. I mean, it's got its downsides, of course, as well, because it just goes to show how how tightly strapped the sector is, but it's very characteristically a very altruistic sector, and resource sharing is something very common. So things like staffing or equipment, sharing facilities, knowledge and information, access to specialists was something very typical. And there's a whole slew of other workarounds as well that are inside the guidelines, which we really encourage you to take a look at. When selecting your strategies, there's a number of things you want to consider to make sure that you're selecting something that makes sense. A really great opportunity to pause and think about how GBA Plus factors into selecting and implementing strategies. So in addition to the traditional things that we look at when we're selecting a strategy, which is the functionality, is it going to work for me? To what degree is it going to enable me to continue to deliver the service? Is it costly? Can I maintain it well? Is it going to be reliable when the time comes for me to use it? These are all the traditional questions that we ask, but it's extremely important to also ask about any barriers that we might be creating as a result of selecting a strategy. And let's say I come up with an alternate site from which to deliver my services. It's important to think about, the folks who are going to implement it. What barriers have we put in place now, or how difficult have we made it for those individuals to implement the strategy? Is it doable? Have we talked to them about it? Have we considered their perspectives? And as the folks who are going to implement it, the folks who are going to maintain it, what barriers have we put in place for them? Is it doable? Is it going to be a challenge? And what kind of challenges are they going to face? And of course, the most obvious one is on the service users, the folks who are going to now have to work within that strategy or the backup or the workaround that you've created. Who might you have excluded as a result of implementing a strategy? Have you considered what their experience will be like by trying to access the service in a different way? So a lot of these considerations, again, inside the guidelines, and we really encourage you to take a look at those and ask these important questions as you think about how you would continue to deliver services in an emergency. And for my last slide, we'll just jump into step number 5, which is the service continuity planning document itself. So this is the document or the set of instructions where you're going to actually collate all the details that you've collected about the strategies that you've selected. So it's going to identify, of course, what is it that we're going to do when the disaster hits or the emergency hits, and we need to continue to deliver our services, the roles and responsibilities associated with those. So who's going to take action on what items, who has the authority to make decisions in a particular situation, and how do we get in touch with them? So of course, you're going to have contact information for all your key personnel, the response teams, the employees or volunteers who execute the functions, and of course, certainly the service users who are going to need to know about the impacts about the impacts of the event and how you've changed your organizational operations in response to that. The actual procedures on how to activate a strategy. So if you've chosen to have a backup generator in case the power goes out, you want to have instructions about obviously how to turn on the generator. So things that are very straightforward like that should be easily accessible and, as Carmen mentioned as well, maintained, because the last thing you want to do is pull out a set of instructions that are outdated and discover that fact that they're outdated in the event itself. So really encourage you to take a look at the guidelines and follow through with some of the examples and activities that are inside. And hopefully they'll make it a lot easier for you to navigate this process. You could do it step by step, doesn't all have to be done at once. And I've heard it said before, and I do stand by it myself as well. Sometimes the process of even just walking through service continuity planning and having the conversations is enough as a starting point. So you don't have to think of, at the end, I'm going to have a whole library of terrific documents that I'm going to maintain every single year. The value is in the planning process, in the discussion, in the exploration. And if you can get a chance to walk yourselves through this process, I think it would be a very value add activity for yourselves. And I'll pause there and pass it back over to Carmen.
Okay, so we can go to the next slide. All right, so what is next? So moving forward, we can just skip right ahead as well to the next slide. Okay, so the guidelines can be found now on the Canadian Women's Foundation website. Please take a look at them. I hope that you find them useful and that you can take them back to your organization. Also, you'll notice a email address on the screen. So if you have any questions or comments that you would like to share about the guidelines, please email the email address, communityinitiatives@canadianwomen.org. And the Canadian Women's Foundation can pass on any questions to our team, and we'd be happy to connect with you on those. I also believe that Karen will drop the link to the guidelines in the chat for everyone. So you can click on that link, take a look, and we hope that we got you excited about service continuity, and hopefully you'll run back to your organizations next week and start on your planning process. I mean, no pressure, but yeah, we can skip on to the next slide, I think. So that wraps up our presentation for today. Thank you so much for being here today. We do just have some acknowledgements. So firstly, we'd like to thank the Canadian Women's Foundation for initiating this important project. Combining GBA Plus and emergency management is critical. And as we previously mentioned, it's not a common practice yet in Canada. So this work is quite innovative. In fact, this project is the first of its kind in Canada. So we're very grateful to the foundation for putting this together. And we are also thankful to be a part of this team and to be a part of this project. We also want to thank everyone who contributed to the project, say a very huge thank you to the Sector Advisory Committee members. If you're here today, thank you so much for taking the time out of your already most likely insane schedules to provide the much needed guidance and support for these guidelines. We definitely couldn't have done this without you. We also want to thank all the participants in the survey that went out. Your input helped shape the guidelines, and we appreciate the time taken away from your critical work to provide your input. Lastly, thank you to all of you who are here today for taking the time out of your busy schedules. We're honored to share these guidelines with you, and we really do hope that you will find them useful and that you can take them back to your organizations. So thank you, and then we can go to the next slide. Okay, so that wraps up the presentation. I think we can now go to questions. So Karen, if we have any questions, we would be happy to hear what they might be and see if we can answer them.
That's great. I'm just coming back on mic and back on my camera, and maybe the tech team can spotlight me as well. Thanks so much, you folks, for that amazing presentation and for all of the incredible work that you've done to put these guidelines together. They're really, I think, first of a kind for the sector, and it's really exciting to see them and to see how we can get them rolling out and implemented. I will just remind you all that if you would like to ask a question about anything you've heard, you can please go ahead and pop something in the chat box. I do have two questions that I would like to ask you just to kind of get things started. The first is, what advice would you have for organizations that sort of maybe don't have a lot of resources, but they want to make a start at this emergency preparation thing? And you know, what do you think would be the first thing that they could do, or one of the first couple of steps that they could do just to kind of move it forward?
Or do you guys mind if I?
Yeah, go for it, Magda.
Okay. I think I'm known on the team for doing this, so thanks for your patience. No, so that's a great question, Karen, and thanks for asking it. I think we've actually structured the guidelines in the way that we would recommend folks actually tackle the process, which is really just having that conversation first and foremost about what it is that you do and what it is that's important to you. What's the most critical thing? And I know that it sounds like an obvious process, but just going through and having that conversation to hear about all right, we carry out the following activities. This is our mission. This is our goals. All right, we have our compass. We know where we want to go, and kind of drawing out that map for yourself. It's incredible how much insight organizations will get through going through a process like that, because you make so over the years, and maybe you get really comfortable working at your organization, you get comfortable in the day-to-day, you become really familiar with the activities, and you maybe don't spend a lot of time evaluating the importance of all those things. And so suddenly, you find yourself in a time of disaster emergency and you think, well, I got to carry out that role as I do every day, but then I also got to take on more. And that's a pretty, that's probably one of the most dangerous ways to approach emergency management, because you end up doubling or tripling your workload. And that's where, what Carmen was mentioning earlier, where you're risking burnout and that sort of thing. So just the first 2 steps of sitting down, and we've got the worksheets inside the guidelines as well. What do I do? What's important to me? What resources are essential? What do I need to protect? It completely changes your frame of mind around what am I doing here? So I'm not suddenly, creating a whole new organization or a whole series of new activities in order to respond to this new dynamic event that's happened. You make these choices proactively. You know where you want to go. You think about that together. You have a common conversation at a time where you have a moment to reflect, and you're not experiencing all the pressures of what an emergency will pile on top of you. So those first 2 steps are what I would say, but I'll let Alex and Carmen build on or refute that if they think so.
I mean, I think you captured it, Magda. The other thing I would say is don't be afraid to start the process. Don't be afraid to try. I think with GBA Plus and service continuity planning, a lot of the learning is actually by the doing, and you learn by doing. So that's really a part of it. And it's an iterative process. So as you continue to work through the planning, you're going to learn some new things, you're going to have new experiences, and that's going to inform the next iteration of your plan and what's going on for you as an organization within your specific context around funding and what have you. So don't be afraid. It feels maybe overwhelming. It sounds a bit overwhelming, but as Carmen has said as well, and Magda, taking those small steps, having the conversation, making time in your organization, building that time into your meetings if possible, and allocating someone or designating somebody to sort of oversee that really helps to move the process forward, because it's the implementation part that's really tricky. So you have the know-how and you have some resources, but it's the actual doing that is what we need to help organizations shift to.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing real quick. One of our sector advisory committee members had the suggestion of incorporating your service continuity plan right into your strategic planning process, so that it's a part of your strategic plan. And when you're working on your strategic plan, you're also working on your service continuity. So yeah.
That's great advice. Thank you very much for that. You folks have been working in the emergency management field for some time, and what I gather is that it's a pretty male-dominated space. You can correct me if I'm incorrect about that assumption. And we know from talking to folks who are doing this work at the municipal level, folks who are doing this work in different spaces, that gender-based analysis is not typically, included in these kinds of plans, which I think makes these guidelines really special. I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments about the applicability of what you've produced here for other spaces outside of the gender-based violence space. Do you think it would be relevant or transferable into other sectors too?
Yeah, I personally think that absolutely it can be transferable. I mean, the guidelines are very specific to this sector. However, I think other nonprofit organizations can also use this tool or these guidelines. And I think there is, and you're right, it is very male dominated, and incorporating that intersectional gender-based analysis really isn't done very commonly. Yeah, I mean, I've worked for government and emergency management, and yeah, it is very command and control, very kind of top-down approaches, not very inclusive, not very, don't really consider that intersectional lens. And so, yeah, it's a big need, honestly. It's a huge need, and it's super important. And yeah, I think that a lot of work can be done in that area. But yeah, if you know, entities can use these guidelines as kind of, you know, a guide or maybe a template to work on their own things to adapt it, I think that would be great.
Yeah. And I'll just add that, you know, GBA plus or intersectional analysis is cross-cutting. It doesn't really matter the sector that you're in. It really can be applied to whatever field of practice that you're participating in. And traditional emergency management doesn't really account for sort of the social constructs of disasters, some of that social vulnerability at a deeper level. I think it just tends to look at basic needs, which are still important. You know, you've got your shelter and food and safety, but it does need to look at the spaces that people are living and working within and the power dynamics around that. And that's why it's really important to implement intersectional analysis, because that helps inform not only the planning, but then the response and then the recovery, so that people are not being disproportionately impacted during disasters. And this is something that we've been very passionate about. We're really happy to support the Canadian Women's Foundation. You've done some great work. You've also sponsored some research around this. So it's something that I think, I'll speak for my colleagues if I can, that we're really trying to emphasize and encourage and raise awareness around the importance of considering not just gender. Of course, we want to have an intersectional approach, but even gender is not really factored into traditional emergency management. So it's really creating a transformative shift in this sector. And I think opportunities to speak and to produce really groundbreaking content, such as the guidelines, are going to help make that shift and really amplify the voices around what we need to make sure that disasters are not causing additional harm than they need to.
Yeah, thanks for those thoughtful responses. I think, you know, we refer to that in the sector sometimes as gender mainstreaming or gender and intersectionality mainstreaming, trying to get this particular perspective included and embedded in the systems and practices of folks who don't look at gender primarily all the time. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting project that you all have embarked on to make this happen within your field. It's really fantastic. I have a question here from Leanne McMillan, who is asking, can you give us a few sample questions that are asked with a GBA plus lens? I guess probably thinking about within the toolkit. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I think part of that, I mean, if you're thinking of strategies that you might want to implement, and Magda, Carmen, jump in at any point, but looking at, we have a list of example strategies folks may want to incorporate for their organizations. And so I think one of it is, you know, for example, reducing services that you can provide to service users. And so some of the questions you might want to ask is like, well, what are the assumptions that you're making around that? Who's being impacted and why? What are the resources that are available? Are you creating additional barriers? So it's really about a thoughtful process around the decisions that you're making and trying to forecast potentially what are some of the intended and unintended consequences and who's going to be experiencing those. So those are just some of the examples of questions. And in the appendices, we did provide a bit of a process. It's borrowed from the Women and Gender Equality Canada and from the BC government around some questions to ask as you go through the steps. It's a pretty linear process, but it's meant to help inform and really kind of get you thinking about going broader than what's really right in front of you and thinking about what those impacts could be. So that's just one example. I don't know if anybody else, I don't want to hog the timer, but if anybody else wants to share a strategy or what have you, or if that example is sufficient.
I think that's a great example. One maybe that I'll add as well, because I'm the disaster emergency person, I'm going to say expert, but person who's coming in with very little exposure. So I'm very much on the other side of the fence here. And where I see the most significant departure from traditional approaches to business continuity. Well, first of all, it's called business continuity normally. That's why I keep saying it. I keep stumbling across my words, is that it's so designed for the corporate sector is very centered on that world, that immediately we knew that, that's a departure. We're not going down that way. We're looking at things more broadly. So it's even a language that I got to get used to speaking after almost a decade of saying it differently. But the area that I noticed the biggest departure was in the criticality assessments. So again, I'm very accustomed to a particular corporate way of evaluating what's important, right? And I think right away, and hearing you folks speak and spending so much time with the Sector Advisory Committee, and Alex and Carmen have shared so much wisdom with me over the last couple of months, but just right away, that departure from what's important in one world versus what's important in a different world fundamentally changes the process. So there's a number of questions just embedded throughout that part of the guidelines that challenges, certainly if you're an emergency manager or a disaster emergency manager or business continuity. I'll say business continuity because most of those folks are coming from the business continuity side of things, and they're trying to now apply or navigate into this other world that operates so differently to what they're accustomed to. If you're coming into this space, it's going to challenge you to look at things very differently in a way that you might not have assessed. So you might have come in with definitely your corporate assumptions of productivity and outputs and profit being a huge portion of something that you need to focus on during an event, during a disaster, and right away those definitions go out the window. And so I think the most interesting part for me, where I learned the most and I was challenging my thinking the most, was right away. It's like, what is important and why? Big left turn from what I'm used to, and that was an exciting part of the process for me to spend some time with the GBA specialists who helped me open my eyes to that.
Thank you for sharing that reflection, Magda. It really is insightful and helpful for us to understand. We had a session yesterday. For those of you who were online yesterday, you'll remember that we had Eileen Boissonneau and Loli Rico, who were talking about what happens when emergency management plans that are, developed in a community don't do this very thing that you're talking about, that they're not centering the needs, and they're not of the most marginalized communities, and they're not necessarily thinking about it in the context of care. They're thinking about it in a different way altogether. And so when that happens and folks are left out of the picture of those plans, then community organizations are stepping in to fill those gaps. And they were reflecting on what that meant for them, what that looked like in a context of working with First Nations folks in communities, working with precarious status and undocumented migrant folks, where the state was basically coming to them and saying, these folks are falling outside the bounds of our emergency plans. Can you help us fix that? Overstretching yet again an already overstretched sector. So really fascinating to hear how that sort of model, the corporate kind of model that is implemented in these other spaces, misses out on really important things. I'm also just going to put in the chat the research that Alex was referring to. So I've just posted it there for you all as well.
Karen, I just want to touch on what you said. I think it's so important, and we say this often, but for some reason it just gets neglected, that we have to involve community in our planning, response, recovery. And one of the great aspects around GBA Plus is asking, like, what's informed your decision? Like, how are you, like, what are the assumptions that you're making? And who did you ask? Who did you include? And who's missing from that? And I think if we can do a better job of that, then our approaches will be more fulsome, will be more inclusive, and we'll have less folks falling through the gaps and experiencing inequity.
Okay, so I think that ends it for our question and answer period. I don't see any more questions coming in, and I would like to give the floor over, if it's all right with you, to Adriana to share with us the illustration that she has created through the course of the discussion today. So I'm going to invite Adriana to come online with us now.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to be with all of you today as I guess, a continuation of the conversation that began yesterday that Karen was just mentioning. some elements that I want to highlight. I don't want to go through all the details because we just went through the presentation, but I'm hoping that this visual can serve also as a roadmap as you go and look at the document of the guidelines, that you might be able to use them both as tools for sharing this work also with your teams when you go back and you start having these conversations. I was reflecting on ways in which this can be implemented even in our daily lives, and how maybe that's also a way of bringing these conversations even with our families and our communities. I am especially thinking of that because I work on my own, like my business is myself. So thinking about like when disaster hits, like what are the elements that I would put forward myself. And something that jumped up at me a lot during the conversation is the importance of involving all the members of the organization in this work, just to be able to make sure that it is something more than a document that stays on a shelf, that it becomes embedded in everyday action and in everyday understanding of how we want to work, and also thinking about organizational well-being, community well-being, and individual well-being, and how it's all tied together. One cannot function without the other. So also highlighting the importance of these plans to be able to protect staff and volunteers and the people who are providing the services, who are also probably looking for support themselves, so that this idea of continuity of care also made me think of like chain of connections and relationships, and how we need each other, but we need to know how to best connect with one another and serve one another. And that comes with being able to ask the right questions, and that comes from understanding, I guess, having that intersectional lens and being able to ask questions that might not be so apparent. So bringing forward what is kind of left kind of in the shadows. And then one other element that I wanted to just like bring back again is the idea of the proactive iterative process, and how the plans have to be able to change and adapt and be maintained, because organizations and needs and who is receiving services always changes. And so the plans have to be able to adapt to that as well. This was super very informative for me, and a pleasure to be able to put it on paper in a different form. And yeah, and I hope that that once you receive this, once it's finalized, it can be a tool that can support you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I know some folks are having trouble. I can see in the chat pinning the image to the screen. Sorry about that, but we'll be sure to share the image as well once Adriana finalizes it. We'll get it up on the website and make sure you all can see it. Just if you're trying to do it, if you just hover over the image, there should be in the top right corner 3 little dots that appear. And then if you click on them, you can click pin, and then you can see the beautiful work that Adriana has just done for us. Amazing. Thank you so much. So I think with that, I would like to just say a big thank you to Alex and Magda and Carmen for the great work that you've produced for us, and also for your time and contributions to the conversation today, for orienting our audience to the great work that you've done. So giving you a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over now to Dorothy.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Carmen, Magda, and Alex. This was so insightful. And thank you also to you, Adriana. So this is what closes the first part of this workshop today, as we're online with this ongoing summit, online summit. So we'll be looking back to see you in a few minutes. Well, you still have like some minutes now to be able to stretch out. So we're going to be back at 2:50 p.m. Eastern time, for the plenary on pandemic response and recovery. So we invite you, like I said, to take a stretch break, and we look forward to seeing you all back here at the same link in a few minutes. That being said, before you leave, I want to thank again, yes, Karen, yes, the panelists, but obviously I want to thank also the whole team, the technical team, for always being there for us and helping us go through this conversation in such a beautiful manner, and it is so smooth, and this is what we want. So see you at 2:50 p.m. this afternoon Eastern time at the same link. So see you soon. Bye-bye.